Welcome everyone to IT Audit webinar training via practical application presented jointly by AuditNet and Richard Cascarino and Associates. This webinar is part of the Training Without Travel series covering IT Audit, and today's webinar covers performance auditing of the IT function. My name is Jim Kaplan. I'm founder and owner of AuditNet, and I'll be moderating today's webinar. Joining us is Richard Cascarino, principal of Richard Cascarino and Associates, who will cover this 2-hour session. Let me have Richard introduce himself and give you a brief overview of his background, and then I'll cover the housekeeping items for today's webinar. Richard?
Thanks, Jim. For those of you who've been with us in full series, I apologize for you having to listen to this again. For those of you who are coming in new, welcome. My name is Richard Cascarino. I'm a principal of Richard Cascarino and Associates based out of Steamboat Springs in Colorado and Johannesburg in South Africa. My background, I have over 30 years experience in IT audit training and consultancy. I am a past president of the Institute of Internal Auditors here in South Africa, a member of ISACA, a member of the Association of Certified Fraud Examiners, and the author of a few books. Probably the most relevant to this one is The Auditor's Guide to IT Auditing. I'll pass you back to Jim and he can take you through some of the housekeeping.
Thanks, Richard. It's great to have you with us today. We sent out the slides this morning, and you should have all received a copy of the slides. They were sent as an attachment, so I'm not going to read the housekeeping items and the disclaimer, but I'll just cover them briefly. We are recording today's webinar, and you will receive a link to the recording. So watch out for that. That should be coming in a follow-up email tomorrow. Also, please help us by completing the evaluation that you'll see at the end of the webinar to help us improve our webinars. Because today's session is under NASBA rules, we are required to ask polling questions, and you're required to answer those polling questions to qualify for CPE. You don't have to necessarily answer the questions correctly. Richard would like you to. However, the important thing is that you respond to the question just to show that you're paying attention and that you're not multitasking and doing other things. You can submit questions via the chat box on your screen, and we encourage you to do that. We'll answer them usually at the time that we break for a polling question. The next slide provides information about our disclaimer. And again, those were sent out this morning, so I'm not going to read them. I'm going to turn the floor over to Richard to get started with today's session on performance auditing of the IT function. Richard?
Thanks, Jim. Okay, we're going to have a look at performance auditing. Question, what is performance auditing? We'll have a look at the background of where this all originated and what the objectives of value for money auditing, which was the forerunner for performance auditing, what they were. We'll have a look at different types of methods of operational auditing and the techniques involved in them. We'll have a look again at the major operational areas of IT and how you would measure performance within each of those areas. We'll take a look at some of the risks and control opportunities within those areas. Have a look at economy of resource utilization, efficiency determination of the key performance areas for IT within your particular organization. We'll take a look at how on earth do you quantify effectiveness of IT. We spend an awful lot of money on IT, but is IT actually effective in terms of achieving corporate objectives? We'll look at implementing the VFMA audit program, I should read program, not programmer, and performing the audit and following up. Okay. So what is operational auditing? Why bother? Who cares? Well, this is out of ISACA's VAL IT, out of the 2008 version. This has now been incorporated within COBIT, the latest version. But they found that a 2002 Gartner survey found that 20% of all expenditures on IT is a complete waste of money. Now that's frightening, because on a global basis, the annual destruction of value would come to somewhere around about $600 billion. Now, where does all that money go? Well, a 2004 study by IBM of the Fortune 1000 CIOs found that on average, the CIOs believe that 40% of all IT spending brought no return to the organizations. So from 2002 to 2004, we've gone from 20% to 40%, and from 600 billion to 1.2 trillion. A 2006 study by the Standish Group found that only 35% of all IT projects succeeded, while the remainder, 65%, either collapsed or were challenged, as they say. So, generally speaking, we're spending an awful lot of money on IT, but we're not actually getting value for the organization out of the money that we're spending. Why not? And this is a question that's been asked over and over again, and IT audit get asked, IT consultants get asked, what are we doing wrong? What should we be doing? Help us. So let's take a look at performance auditing and where it came from. Value for money auditing started off in Canada, as many innovations within audit do, and it started originally with the Canadian Comprehensive Auditing Foundation. From Canada, it spread to the United States. It was picked up by the UK, and it was picked up by Australasia, and finally made its way south to the Republic of South Africa. So it arrived here some years ago. Now, when we talk value for money and we talk performance, what's the difference between value for money auditing and performance auditing and operational auditing? We'll have a look at some of these concepts. We'll take a look at what is value for money auditing, and we'll take a look at the triple E's, economy, efficiency, and effectiveness, and how this lot fits in with all of the other audits that we do within an IT environment. If you look at value for money, definition of value for money itself, value for money deals with the measures which are introduced to ensure that allocated resources are utilized in an economic, efficient, and effective manner. Well, that sounds fairly good. We take the resources that we've allocated, and the resources are generally taken to be the 5 M's. Manpower, money, materials, machines, and methods. Those are generally accepted as the 5 resources which management has to play with. And it's a balancing act. Management can trade off money and employ more manpower. They can trade off improved methodologies and reduce their manpower, but that might actually cost more money. So again, a balancing act where management takes the resources and trades one off against the other in order to achieve corporate objectives. Now, which corporate objectives? Well, whichever ones the corporation has decided on in an economic, efficient, and effective manner. And those get mixed up sometimes. When value for money auditing first came to South Africa, there was a problem because people did not understand what the concept of value for money auditing was. Roughly we knew what value for money was, but value for money auditing, the independent and systematic examination of any organization for the purpose of providing objective information so it can be challenged and it will stand up, to indicate where improvements can be made in the economy, efficiency, and effectiveness of its operations and resources. Now that's as it came across from America and from the UK. When it got to South Africa, the Auditor General of South Africa, at that time a gentleman called Dr. Joop de Loer, set up a project to look at how they were going to implement value for money auditing within the government section. And I was the incoming president of the Institute of Internal Auditors at the time, and we were setting up a project on that basis too. So I contacted Joop de Loer and we put the two projects together and we developed it jointly. And what came out of that was that efficiency and effectiveness were pretty reasonably understood, but economy wasn't. Economy got mixed up because when we talk about the 5 resources, one of them is money. So if I use less money, am I being economical or am I being more efficient? And eventually they dropped, within South Africa, out of performance auditing, they dropped economy altogether. And they said, if we can get effectiveness and efficiency, we've got enough. That's good performance. Once we've got that intact, then we'll worry about economy of operations. So what do we mean by efficiency, effectiveness, and economy? Why did those things get mixed up? Economy refers to the terms and conditions under which resources are acquired. Okay, so if we're saying that money is a resource, how did you get that money? What is that money costing you? If you had to borrow that money, then you're paying interest. If you're using money that you already have, then you're using it for project A instead of project B. That's an opportunity cost. If you'd used the money for project B, maybe it would have been more beneficial to the company. So even money as a resource, you can be economical in the amount of money that you use, which is an efficiency thing, and the cost of money, which is an economy thing. So an economic operation procures resources, whether it's men, money, materials, machines, or methods, in an appropriate quality and quantity at the lowest overall cost and at the right time. And that's how we measure economy. Now that's an important aspect for auditors to work within, looking at economy. Efficiency looks at the relationship between the goods or services produced and the resources used to produce them. And an efficient operation will either produce the maximum output for a given set of inputs, or alternatively, the minimum inputs for a given level of goods or services required. So you can either be efficient by doing more for less, doing more for the same amount, or doing the same amount for less. 3 possible ways you can be efficient. Okay, now it's funny when we start talking about efficiencies within organizations. As soon as you start talking efficiencies, management says cost savings. We must do the same for less. Well, sometimes that's not possible. If you have invested in plant and equipment and you've put 20 million into a new factory, you cannot reduce the cost of that 20 million. You've already spent it. It's a sunk cost. The best that you can do is improve what's coming out of that factory. You've already got that cost. So you cannot reduce that particular cost as an input. So the best thing you can do is improve the outputs. In the same way as in times of recession, one of the first things that management does is take a look at HR. If you look in many organizations, you'll find that the Up on the wall, there will be a value statement. And the value statement will say something like, our number one asset is our people. Our most valued asset is our people. But at times of recession, what do you get rid of first? We get rid of people. Why? Because they're easily replaced. So it's a very valuable asset, but not so valuable that we'll hang on to it if times get tough. So, different aspects to efficiency. What is effectiveness then? Effectiveness is the extent to which a program achieves its goals or any other intended effects. If I set you a task of getting from Denver to New York, what would be the most efficient way of getting there? You've got no other criteria, just get to New York. The most efficient way of getting there would probably be to walk. That's the one that would consume least resources. Even better, hitchhike and you're consuming somebody else's resources. If, on the other hand, I set you a target of getting to New York by tomorrow morning, then you have no choice. You will fly. But now we can talk about who are you going to fly on? Of all the airlines, which one can get you there at the right time, in time for your meetings? There's 4 different airlines can get you there. Fine. Which one will cost least? And now we start talking about economy. The resource I'm going to use is the money on the airfare. But how cheaply can I get that airfare? Now we're talking about economy. So when we start applying this in the workplace, one of the critical elements, and the most critical element normally, is effectiveness. There is no point in getting to New York cheaply if you arrive too late for your meeting. There may be another way of attending the meeting. You may be able to do it electronically. And that's another alternative. You've got to be careful when you start talking about effectiveness. What do you mean by effectiveness? Is it getting to New York that will be a measure of effectiveness, or is it attending the meeting in person or in virtual time? So we've got to be careful when we start looking at these. You'll see on this next slide the attributes of effectiveness. Now, this is a very busy slide. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to break out of this and I'm going to zoom in so that we can actually look at this in a bit more detail. And if I take where we are and we move up. Now this is the attributes of effectiveness as laid down by the Canadian Comprehensive Audit Foundation. And when we start looking within this thing, you'll see that the number one attribute that they laid down was management direction. The extent to which the objectives of the organization, its components, its programs, or lines of business, and its employees are clear, well integrated and understood, and appropriately reflected in the organization's plans, procedures, delegations of authority, and decision-making process. In other words, if management doesn't know where we're going, you have no chance of getting there. Or put it another way, if management doesn't know where you're going, then anywhere you end up is as good as anywhere else, which is not the object of the exercise. So, number one, management direction. Number two is relevance. The extent to which a program or line of business continues to make sense with regard to the problem or conditions it was intended to respond to. And that's one that you'll come across very commonly when you do operational auditing, performance auditing, in any area in the organization, but particularly in IT, you'll find that we are doing things that we did 10, 15 years ago. And the reason we did it 15 years ago was because we had a business requirement, a security requirement, a compliance requirement that necessitated doing things in that way. The business has moved on. The risk profile has moved on. Doing it that way does not actually make sense anymore. But if you were doing a compliance audit, you'd be coming in and saying, well, Company Policy 184621-3 requires that we do the following. And you're not doing it, and therefore that is a finding, and I'm going to report that, and we recommend that you do it from now on. An operational audit will take a look at it and say, why the hell are you still doing that? It doesn't make sense. Well, the auditors told us we had to do it. Well, that was true 10 years ago, but not anymore. We can eliminate, perhaps, that particular control, that particular line of business. In IT terms, you could be running programs that nobody uses anymore. Appropriateness. The extent to which the design of program or its major component and the level of effort being made are logical given the specific objectives to be achieved. And again, you can find yourself in a situation in IT where we are doing tasks that still need to be done, but we're doing it in a way that made sense years ago but doesn't now. Let me give you an example. An organization I did work with spent, let me get this right, 8 years and 16 million developing an online, real-time, relational database petty cash system. By the time they had finished it, when they started it, there was no such thing as a PC. By the time they had finished it, you could buy a PC, a printer, and the software to run a petty cash system for $1,500. It didn't make sense anymore, but we've started, so we'll finish. And they carried on with the development knowing that it was a complete waste of time, put it live, and immediately scrapped it. Achievement of intended results. The extent to which the goals and objectives have been realized. And again, it's one of the problems that you face within IT when you start looking at performance characteristics and you start saying, okay, what are you trying to achieve? Well, we're trying to develop a human resources system. Terrific. How will you know when you've achieved that? Well, when the user signs off on the human resources system. Okay. From a business perspective, what is that supposed to achieve for the business? I don't know. The user just wants it. So if you don't know what this is going to achieve for the business, how can you ever measure whether it's achieved it or not? So those key performance indicators that tell me this is a good system is not, does the user like it? Is it contributing what it was intended to contribute? And simply developing the system because we wanted to develop the system is not good enough. Acceptance. This is where the users come in. The extent to which a constituency of customers for whom a program or line of business is designed judge it to be satisfactory. And this is where the user says, yes, this is what I wanted, this is satisfying my requirements. Over and above the business requirements, this is satisfying my requirements. It may well be that it's not the most all-singing, all-dancing system that we could get, but it fits my business needs and it fits the resources I have available to run the system. I don't have computer experts to run my system. I've got standard users. So I need a system that they can use, and I'll get more out of that than I'll get out of a system that's all singing, all dancing, but nobody knows how to use it. Secondary impacts, the extent to which other significant consequences, either intended or unintended, and either negative or positive, have an impact. I've got a question, can I go back to the full screen presentation? Yes, I can. Does that make it easier for you to see? Let me close that and go back to that. Can we have a show of hands? Is that easier? Okay, I'll leave it with that. That's fine. As long as everyone can see it, because I know it is a busy slide. Cost and productivity. We're looking at the relationships between costs, inputs and outputs. And that's an interesting one, once again, because this is where everybody gets confused. If you achieve your cost target, are you being economical? Are you being efficient? Because that's one of the measures of effectiveness. So we're looking at the relationship among costs, inputs and outputs. Responsiveness. Here we're looking at the ability of the organization to adapt to changes, and again those changes can be looking at the market sector that you're operating in, it can be looking at the competition, it can be responding to availability of resources, it can be responding when technology changes. A lot of companies invested a tremendous amount of money into systems which, when mobile computing came along, were not that adaptable for mobile computing. And now they're stuck because they've put so much money into these systems, they need a 3 or a 5 or a 15-year lifespan to recover the cost of developing them. Financial results, we're looking at the matching of and accounting for revenues and cost, and the accounting and valuation of assets, liabilities and equities. The working environment, again a measurement of effectiveness, the extent to which the organisation provides an appropriate work atmosphere for its employees and provides appropriate opportunities for development, achievement, etc. Protection of assets, the extent to which important assets, and this is an interesting one for IT, such as sources of supply, valuable property, including intellectual property, key personnel, agreements and important records or information are safeguarded so that the organisation is protected from the danger of loss that could perhaps put you out of business. And finally, monitoring and reporting, the extent to which key matters pertaining to performance and organisational strength are identified, reported and carefully monitored. Now, if all of that is effectiveness, then why do we worry about economy and all the rest? Why not just go for effectiveness and say everything is effectiveness? The problem is it's not easy to measure when you're trying to wrap it all under one umbrella. So when we start looking at the interrelationship between economy, efficiency and effectiveness, and we look at the theoretical structure of operations within one particular business area and the areas that we review and the aspects that we are investigating. We've got 3 things that are done in any business area. We put things in, inputs, men, money, materials, machines and methods. We process them. We convert men, money, materials, machines and methods in IT into systems, availability, responses, information, conversion of data to information, and then we output it. When we're looking at inputs, we're primarily talking about cost of input. Now that input could be human beings. Are you using a sledgehammer to crack a nut? Are you using a very expensive senior programmer in an area where you could use a trainee? So there we're looking at economy and the procurement of resources at the lowest possible cost. Now we've got the resources, we've got the computers, we've got the manpower, we've got the methodologies and the systems. Now we're looking at efficiency. Are we using those inputs appropriately? Are we maximizing the outputs with the given inputs or minimizing the inputs for a given set of outputs? So the doing of the job, whether it's developing systems or whether it's running them on an ongoing basis, are we processing efficiently? And then ultimately we get to the output side, the determining what extent predetermined goals and objectives have been achieved, are being achieved, will continue to be achieved. And that's our measurement of effectiveness. Now if we get all of that right, then what we're saying is on an economy side, can the same be achieved with less funds? On the efficiency side, is optimal utilization of resources being accomplished? And on the effectiveness side, are the predetermined policy objectives being achieved? And that brings us to our first polling question, which is looking at effectiveness. Please vote now. Almost got everyone voted. Remember, if you're working with a tablet, you may not be able to respond online. In that case, take a note of the answers to these, record them all and send one email to Jim so that he can update your records and keep you in line for NASBA rules. Okay. I'll close the poll and share the results. And as you can see, the majority of people have gone for the extent to which a program achieves its objectives. And that would be correct. Okay. The relationship between the goods produced and the resources used is efficiency. Cost of resources is economy. Now, how does all of this lot fit into auditing and auditing IT? Well, it comes back to our scope and objectives for doing the audit. And the scope is limited only by whatever your mandate is. What are you supposed to be doing? Now, it's a difficult one because many managers, when you get into this, will see you as being critical of them. So technically it becomes like tap dancing on eggs. It's a very, very sensitive nature for making policy decisions. The objectives are improvement in the quality of management information, implementation of methods to report on performance within our IT function, improving the utilization of the resources, getting more bang for our buck, and provision of measures for improved accountability and responsibility. Well, that sounds good. Where do we start? Well, starting a value for money audit or a performance audit, first place you have to start is at the beginning. Okay. I always refer back to a textbook from many years ago called Alice in Wonderland. And at one point, the Cheshire Cat says to Alice, "How did you get here?" And Alice says, "I hardly know where to start." And the Cheshire Cat replies, "Start at the beginning, go on until you come to the end, and then stop." So this is where we approach our investigation. We start at the beginning. We start with an information session with IT to say, what is it you do? What do you do for your customers? How do you know that you are achieving what your customers need? What are you measuring? How do your customers know? Do your customers know? Based on the information that's coming out of that, we may use an audit steering committee. Now that's not an audit committee, this is an audit steering committee, which will guide us as we audit performance within IT, guiding the project to make sure we are not focusing in on inconsequential areas. We're not missing the big ones. Based on what comes out of that information session, we can then select the focus areas and therefore the audit candidates. Which bits of all of this are absolutely 100% mission critical for IT? And which bits are needed and which bits are nice to have? And once we've decided the critical focus areas, what makes that bit so important? Well, if that wasn't available, okay, so unavailability in that particular area would be your primary focus area. It's got to be as close to 100% available as possible. Yes, right. So now we have a measurement criteria for effectiveness in this area. What about that area over there? Well, that's where we keep all of our data, and that's going to be kept highly confidential. Okay, so confidentiality is a major measurement of performance for that particular part of the business. And we split it up into focal areas. Then we move into our traditional audit planning, execution, reporting, and follow-up. Planning stage, as normal, we have an initial review or walkthrough with the auditee, with the auditee management in that area, selecting the focus areas. What are your key performance areas? What are your key performance indicators? What do you, as a manager, monitor on an ongoing basis to know that you are being effective? What would tell you, if you are being effective, that you're being effective in an efficient manner? So we can select our audit goals and we can select our audit candidates based on that. And we can decide the audit criteria. Now, our audit criteria may be the same as management's. It may not. We can look at how management recognizes that they are being effective. And you might turn around and say, actually, I think they're measuring the wrong things. And you may have to come up with new criteria that you are going to measure against. Now, if you do come up with new criteria, you've now got a problem. Because you're basically saying to management, you have been managing the wrong things in the past. You should have been managing these things. So you're going to have to be very politically correct in getting that message across before you start the audit. If you start an audit measuring against criteria that management does not agree with, then it really doesn't matter what you come up with, because they're going to disagree with you all the way down the line. So you've got to get that audit criteria agreed with them. If it's the same as theirs, that's terrific. If it's not the same as theirs, you've got a problem. You're going to have to win them over at that stage. The work program. Now comes a problem. We've got to sort out the timing. The timing for our work program for carrying out our audit will depend on availability of resources, our own resources, resources at the user end, resources at the IT end. When are the resources available? Can we get them all together at the same time? We can choose our methodology. Our methodology will be dictated to a large extent by the evidence that we're looking for and where that evidence sits. If it sits in somebody's brain, we're going to have to get it out of the brain. We're going to have to interview them. We're going to have to send them questionnaires. If it's sitting inside a computer, we're going to have to interrogate the computer. Using what tool? Using what technique? We're going to have to provide the staffing. Do we have the right skill mix to do that job at that time? Or do we require other resources, in which case we're going to go out and bring in perhaps consultants? Now, the consultants could come from a consultancy firm. They could come from your external auditors, if they have resources. Or they could come from your IT division. One way or the other, all the IA standards say is that the internal audit function needs to have available to it the appropriate knowledge, skills and disciplines to carry out its objectives. We'll talk about that in the next webinar. It doesn't say that you've got to have them in-house. And we've got to look at the cost. And remember, cost is not just monetary cost. It's men, money, materials, machines and methods. Then we can set up meetings for our audit steering committee, and we can either go into an information session at that point or within the execution phase. That's great. Sounds easy. Unfortunately, it's not. Coming up with the focus area and the audit candidates. First question, is the activity defined in terms of an organizational unit, system or function that is to be the subject of an of an audit examination as part of our overall audit program? We want to focus our efforts on areas where we know that planning has been poor in the past, where we've had poor performance in the past, where the users have bitched, internal audit reports have said there's been problems, management reports have said there have been problems, external audit reports have said there have been problems, where we know that high cost exists. Now, maybe the high cost is a requisite of being effective. To achieve that level of effectiveness, you're going to incur these costs, like it or not. Question, do we need to achieve that level of effectiveness? And this is where you may end up doing some Pareto analysis. The 80-20 rule. You get 80% of what you want for 20% of the cost and the effort. It's that last 20% that takes 80% of the resources. So do you really need that last 20%? Or have you set the targets for that particular area within IT too high? And if it is, if it's the right target, then we can look at the cost to say, is there a better way or a cheaper way that will consume less resources, or could we source those resources more economically? Where you know that a legislative body, whether it's the taxman or the Environmental Protection Agency or some form of council or the public have an interest, or where an audit has not been performed in recent times. The only thing you can safely assume is that if an audit has not recently been performed, nobody knows whether it's efficient, effective or economical. These were the focus areas that were set up by the Auditor General of South Africa, Joep de Loer. We also focus in on areas where we believe or we know that inefficient, cumbersome, outdated or quite frankly useless procedures exist. And the critical word there is procedures. It's not controls, it's procedures. In many cases, you're looking at things where there was a business requirement, a justification for it. This might have been a control that was recommended by audit 5 years ago or 10 years ago. And that was terrific at that time. But because the business has moved on, it actually doesn't make sense to do those things anymore, but we're still doing it. And in a conventional audit, the auditors are coming on and insisting that we do it that way. Where critical services are being rendered, where failure to render those services at that time, with that response time, could be mission critical, then the effectiveness controls are 100% critical. You need to get as close to 100% effective control as you can. Where you know problems exist, or where extraordinary service conditions or fringe benefits have been awarded to staff. Because that could be a sign of fraud or irregularities. Small things like FIFA. I would love to know who's doing the audit at FIFA. It's not me. But these irregularities seem to have gone on for an awful long time. I can only claim that when the South Africa was awarded the World Cup, I was in America and had been for 2 years at that time. Okay, so if South Africa paid bribes, I wasn't here. A lot of people said to me, aren't you going to go back for the World Cup? I said, why? Why am I going to go back there for the World Cup? 1996, America had the World Cup. Selecting the focus areas, we're focusing on areas where resources are known to be poorly utilized, where delegations of authority, etc., are either extraordinarily restrictive or allow extraordinary latitude. Where we know that in the past there have been deficiencies. How do we know? Because they came up in previous audits. Where services have been expanded. So this is a new, or it's an old area, but it's got new functionality that's been put in there. Are the measurement criteria that management are relying on for effectiveness, efficiency and economy still making sense? Where the money being spent or the resources being spent is material, or where materiality or risk are being regarded as decisive, i.e. mission critical. You don't get that right, we all go home. We're looking for areas where poor or minimal management information is available. If management don't know if it's under control or not, your only safe assumption is it's not. If they're not sure if they're achieving their targets, the only safe assumption is they're not achieving them until you can prove that they are. Now, I'm being asked for a security information. Where service provision has recently been awarded to external suppliers. Now that can be an awkward one because in many cases you'll find that the service providers have been given a whole checklist of things they must do, services they must provide. But what's very commonly missing is how is management going to measure the achievement of those objectives? And are those the right objectives to be measuring? Where a high staff turnover is experienced, where there are major changes in legislation or policy, major changes in organisational structure have occurred. In many cases, management take their eye off the ball when they're leaving, and nobody looks at the ball when somebody new comes in. One government department I worked with, they went through a change of the chief financial officer. The chief financial officer retired. This is a big government department. The expenditure was somewhere around about 700 billion were the assets under control of the government department. Head of finance retired. They did not appoint a new head of finance immediately. They had an acting head of finance. Now, the acting head of finance did not have the authority to authorize supply chain expenditures over a certain amount. Nevertheless, without those supply chain expenditures, the government department would have had to shut down. So basically, everything went ahead unauthorized. There just was no control because nobody had been put in place. Net effect was that somewhere in the region of 25 million went missing within a 6-month period. Unauthorized expenditure. Nobody was quite sure where the money had gone, what it was for, whether anything had been achieved for it, because nobody signed the documentation. So, major changes in organizational structure should be a red flag that probably the things that we were measuring are not being measured anymore. Abnormal cost escalations or budget variations have been noted. This is more into the efficiency area, where we know that there are insufficient controls. Now, having selected them, what are we going to look at? We're going to look at personnel. We're going to look at information that's being utilized, finance, materials, and management's role. In other words, men, money, materials, machines, and methods. And our audit goal, in any particular focus area or audit candidate, we're looking in broad terms what the audit is expected to achieve, as well as the boundaries within which the investigation team will carry out the examination. And you've got to get that right, because you're now going in to an area where your audit report is either going to say, management, you are doing it right, or management, you are doing it wrong and have been for some time. So you better be very, very sure that you're on firm ground. We need to set our audit criteria. Our audit criteria are very simple. Those standards or norms against which our audit findings are going to be expressed. We're going to do our assessment against that target, judge whether that target has been achieved or not, and we'll determine our conclusions. Now, audit criteria in any particular area of the business should represent good management practices. The problem is you cannot ever say good management practice requires that, because as soon as you say that, it's a question of, well, according to who? Which book says that that's a good management practice? Because my book says it's not. If you can turn around and say that general business practice is done this way, or if you can turn around and point to any kind of international standard, if you can turn around and say that COBIT suggests this would be the best way to do it, because we are not doing it this way, we are suffering these problems. Excessive costs, missing targets, whatever it happens to be. And therefore we recommend that. That can help. So, do you have good standards or norms? And that brings us to a second polling question. Second polling question. In selecting focus areas, the auditor should concentrate on areas where planning is poor, internal evaluation occurs frequently, an audit has been performed recently, areas where high performance and cost exist. We're almost all voted. 5, 4, 3, 2. Close the poll. Share the results. Majority of people have gone for areas where planning is known to be poor or where high performance and cost exist. And the correct answer would probably be planning is poor. Where high cost exists, yes, that would be one, but where high performance exists, not necessarily a problem. It could be high performance, but not as high as it could be. So, why do we worry about all of this? Because we're dealing with the computer. And with the computer, when you bring that in, your control objectives haven't changed. Your business objectives probably haven't changed. They may have. You may be now working in a totally different business environment. But remember, large amounts of stored data are themselves assets. So when we talk about protecting assets, we talk effective use of assets and efficient use of assets. Remember, the data is an asset. It doesn't show up in the balance sheet, but it's a major asset for most organizations. The basic business organization may have changed because that computer system is sitting there. And your controls we talked about on the previous webinar may have migrated out of the user area into the machine. And now how do you know if you're achieving your business objectives? Well, we have to listen to the computer. If it tells us we are, then that's good. You've got integration of systems lead to total dependencies. If one system goes down, it could be a minor system, but that could knock the effectiveness of the whole IT in the organization. It's embarrassing when you've got a computer system to play golf during the lunch breaks, and when that system crashes and brings down the whole of your online system, that's embarrassing. It can also be life-threatening for the organization. So when computers come in, the risks may have changed. The frequency has certainly changed. Manual detection becomes a problem. How do you know if you are failing to achieve your objectives? In many cases, only by getting the computer to monitor itself, and that takes us back into that field that we've talked about in the past on continuous monitoring and continuous auditing. The magnitude of the exposures caused has rocketed because of the dependencies. We're all dependent on the computer. And new causes have been added because of our structures. Now this is the structure that we talked about before. The IT organization with the functional groupings, operations and production, project type functions, technical functions, staff functions. The four major areas. And all of these have to work together to achieve an efficient and effective and economical IT function. Characteristics of operations. The work they do is repetitive. Okay, they follow timetables and they follow schedules. Predictable workloads. They know that at the end of the month, transaction volumes is going to increase. If you are a retail organization, you know that on Black Friday, your IT throughput is going to go through the roof. So if you're not prepared for that, your systems are going to crash. And your systems are then going to be unavailable to a whole pile of customers who are going to be, number one, completely teed off with your organization, and number two, they're going to go elsewhere. So it's predictable workloads, easily measured performance. Normally it's measured by uptime, response time. Typically a high staff turnover within operations. Fairly easy reason. That's an entry point in many organizations. People come in and start off as a trainee operator. and then move up and move out into technical support, or into systems programming or network support, or into programming and moving into the project type functions. It's subject to close supervision because you've got things that they have to achieve, and the performance is normally measured by operational efficiency. Okay, so for operations to be effective, you have to be efficient. Okay, and we measure that by things like achievement of committed schedules, accuracy levels of data processing, percentage of availability time, and basically, did they hit the budget? If they've done all of those things, they have probably been effective as an operational group. If we look at the project functions, this is the systems and programming people. Now, you may not be developing your own in-house systems. You may have partial use of in-house systems, interfacing into package solutions. But project functions, each project is only slightly repetitive. If you're developing a new financial ledger system for the company, whatever you're developing will not be the same as the previous financial ledger. Now, you may be an expert in financial ledgers, but this is a different financial ledger. Otherwise, there's no point in developing it. Projects tend to be of long duration. Now, what is long duration? That could be anything from 3 months to 20 years, depending on the nature of the organization and the size of the project that's been carried out. Very commonly, multidisciplinary skills are required, and again, a high staff turnover. I was speaking to a gentleman some years ago, and he was an industrial psychologist, and he worked for NASA, and he was involved in the first lunar landings. Okay, this wasn't the human beings, this was putting a walker on the moon and a vehicle that could run around, etc. And then eventually, when Apollo 11 went up, they worked on the first human landings on the moon. And he said there was a tremendous loss of staff just after that. Because having landed a man on the moon, what do you do next? You've done it. You've been the first. Now what? So they had a big staff turnover at that time. And he also made another point. He said, do you realize how easy it is to get another job when you've got first lunar landing on your CV? So very commonly when you've got project functions, as they are approaching their implementation, that's when you tend to get the high staff turnover kicking in. And that's when you can have problems controlling your projects. Because if you lose a key member of staff prior to implementation, then you start accepting almost good enough. So project control can become problematic at that stage. Performance rather measured by typically achievement of deadlines, meeting the user requirements, developing systems which themselves will be low maintenance systems, hitting the budget, and the appropriate quality assurance over what's being produced. It's not good enough to hit a time budget or to hit a cost budget. You've got to actually produce the proper goods. Technical services. This is more difficult because you're into a highly specialist orientation. To do performance auditing within IT, within your technical services, whether it's the network, whether it's your DBA, or whether it's your systems programmer, you've got a problem. These are very, very specialized people. If you're going to operate there, you're going to have to gain their respect by your technical competence. You're coming in to tell me I'm doing it wrong? Do you know what you're talking about? Very commonly a low staff turnover. And these people typically have a very narrow sphere of operations. So I am working on the the local area network, or I'm working on the wide area network, but I'm not working on both, or I am the DBA for the Oracle database, but I don't go near the Datacom DB database. Nevertheless, although it's a narrow sphere of operation, they have a huge sphere of influence, because if that person's network goes down, every single user is out of commission. Or if the Oracle database fails, then every single application system is out of commission until we get it back up and running. So it's an enormous sphere of influence. And performance within technical services is typically measured by the percentage availability of systems, again, achievement of user requirements, sub 2-second response time, whatever. Difficult one, the quality of their own research and development. And in many cases, that involves the auditor going to them and say, how do you know you're doing a good job? Because they're the only ones who are measuring themselves. It's self-assessment. In many cases, management do not have the technical competence to performance measure technical services. They don't need that level of competence, and they don't have that level of competence and the technical level. So to a large extent, they can be self-assessing in terms of efficiency and effectiveness. An IS staff function may exist, and that's there to help administer the department, personnel administration, strategic planning, corporate task force membership. I once worked for an organization. I was a project leader with them many years ago, and they employed someone to be their official IT task force member. And that was it. His full-time job was to attend committee meetings, because the head of IT was so fed up. He was spending 80% of his time in committee meetings. He couldn't get anything done. So he employed someone simply to go along in his place and attend all of the committee meetings. They may also assist in helping out over the control responsibilities. We're going to do a value for money audit, an efficiency effective economy audit. Within IT, we have to determine what are the key performance areas. And that means you need to determine where management is going, their long and short-term plans, their budgets. Now, I'm not talking about IS management, I'm talking about general management. Where is the company going? Because if I don't know where the company is going, I've got no way of measuring whether IT is assisting them get there or hindering them get there. Once I know what management's intentions are, then I can identify the critical factors as part of my risk analysis and identify the key performance indicators that will tell us we're going there or we're not going there. And that measure criteria is going to be a combination of management, IS, and the users. And we need to measure all three: efficiency, effectiveness, and economy. Otherwise, you end up measuring a whole pile of management criteria, and you find that you've only measured effectiveness, or you've only measured efficiency, or God forbid, you've only measured economy. So you need to treat those three separately. And that brings us to our third polling question. And the third polling question is taking one at random and saying project functions. Project functions may be measured by percentage of available time, quality of R&D, meeting user requirements, or self-assessment. Please vote now. Almost complete. 5 more seconds. 4, 3, 2, 1.5, 1, 0. Close the poll and share the results. And 91% of people have gone for meeting user requirements. Remember, self-assessment is normally the technical function. Quality of R&D, normally the technical function, not the project functions. Okay. Let us return. So how do we go about all of this lot? When we're looking at the key performance areas, how do we measure their efficiency, their effectiveness, and their economy? Efficiency, we need to sort out the criteria for efficiency. It could be the pacing, how it's going to be measured, how feedback is given, how is efficiency rewarded. And some of the efficiencies that you'll come across will tend to be financial. So we look at consumption of budget as a measurement of efficiency. That may not be true. I've just reviewed the performance report for a government department, and we found that they had spent all of their budget in one department. So in terms of efficiency, they had been efficient. They had not overspent, they had not underspent, they'd spent everything. But of the 5 things they set out to achieve, they'd only achieved 1 of them. So, were they efficient? Or did they just miss the target totally? Sometimes it's financial measurement, sometimes it's non-financial. Remember what we're trying to do with efficiency. We're trying to minimize the input for a given performance. The reason that they had missed those targets was in their planning, they had way underestimated the resources that would be required to achieve them. Now, they spent the budget that they had. They got as far as they could go. But there was no way in God's earth that they were actually going to achieve those objectives. What they should have done is gone back and reassess those objectives a quarter way through the year, not when it comes to the year end. Maximizing the performance for a given input. If you miss a target, it could be a performance related thing, that people are not performing as appropriate, they're not performing as expected, they were not using their budget. That's very common when you find that you're not maximizing performance for the input, when you find that you're underspending your budget and missing your targets. So what we're trying to do is decrease the ratio of input to output, and that can be a physical or monetary measurement, either one. On the effectiveness side, this is where we're looking at the basis for accountability. So we're looking at what is management's direction? Where are they trying to take the organization? In this particular case, we're looking at IT management. Where are they going? Is it relevant to the business purpose? Some years ago, I was asked by a company in Kansas to assist them putting together a strategic plan for IT. And when I went in to look at it, I said, okay, where is the company going? And they said, well, how are we supposed to know that? I said, well, hang on a second. You develop your own in-house systems? Yes. What is the average life of a project? Anything from 2 to 5 years. Okay, so you're spending 5 years developing a project? Yes. How long is that project going to run? 5 years. I said, no. Once it's been accomplished, to get the value for money out of the 5 years expenditure that you have made, how long does that project, that finished product, have to continue to derive benefit for the organization? Well, probably between 8 to 10 years. I said, okay, so right now you are planning for a system that will not be available for 5 years, but will be running your company or driving your company for another 8 to 10 years after that. So you're talking a 13 to 15 year impact horizon, and you don't know where you're going. I said, does anyone know where we're going? Oh, yes, the board of directors do. They have a 5-year plan. I said, great, we'll go and ask them. Oh, they won't tell us, it's confidential. Unless you know where the business is going, you have no way of measuring whether this IT function and the things that it's doing are relevant to the business purpose. Whether their objectives as an IT function are appropriate given the management direction for the whole organization. And you don't know if you've achieved your intended results if you don't know what the intended results were. It's like when they fired off Apollo 11. They did not aim at the moon because they knew that the moon was going to be 3 days journey from the Earth. So they couldn't aim where the moon was, they had to aim where the moon was going to be in 3 days' time. And if you get there too early, you're off into space. And if you get there too late, you're off into space. So you've got to know exactly what your intended results are. The accountability, those measurement criteria have to be accepted by the users. And there will be secondary impacts. The more effective you're trying to be, the more resources you'll probably consume. And it may well be that there's an impact on cost and productivity. It may well be that to be effective, this system is going to have to be switchable as the business environment changes. In another case, it may not be. It could be the financial results, it could be the working environment, it could be any of those measurement criteria for effectiveness. So what do we need to do as auditors? Well, go back to square one. We need to derive what are management's intentions. Do our comparative risk rankings. What can stop this part of the IT function, whether it's the project part or the technical part or the operations part, what can stop it achieving those management intentions? What opportunities could there be that we're missing? And what constraints do we have within our IT function? Because they do not have unlimited resources. It's an unfortunate thing when you look at COBIT and you look at the SACA. For those of you who have written or planning to write CISA, when you're working out what is the correct answer to a CISA question, you assume that you have unlimited resources. You've got as many bodies as you need for segregation of duties. You've got unrestricted resources in terms of machines and methodologies, etc. Because CISA questions are written to ask, what is the best thing that you could do? Not what are you likely to do given in your own business environment. In the business environment, you have resource constraints. You've got a choice, work harder or work smarter. We can do Pareto analysis, the 80-20 rule, and say is that last 20% really required to achieve management's intentions. At the end of the day, we're going for the total quality concept, continuous improvement. Significant issues? Take a look at the key success factors for IT, and particularly IT in the eyes of the users. Are they measurable? If so, are they measured now? And if they're not being measured now, can measurements be designed? You cannot go in saying, I'm going to do a quality assurance review, or I'm going to do a performance audit, or I'm going to do an operational audit of the IT function unless you know what is expected of our IT function. What are they delivering? Key question, is the requirement consistent? Consistent over time, consistent as the business changes? Is it consistently achieved? How do we know? And can it be improved? And if so, is there an ongoing improvement process? Establishing the measurement criteria, we've got to take a look at our IT function and say, what are we going to audit here? You cannot just go in and do an IT audit. I was asked yesterday to give an organization a quotation for conducting an IT audit. I said, okay, fine, no problem. What kind of IT audit are you looking for? IT security audit, IT performance audit, IT availability audit, disaster recovery planning audit, or all of the above? I need to have an inventory of all of the performance areas that could be part of this audit. And that depends to a large extent on the organizational structure and the nature of corporate computing. Is it in-house? Is it outsourced? Is it centralized? Is it decentralized? Is it local or is it on the cloud? Is it in-house developed? Are you using packaged solution? If you are using packaged solution, how much tailoring has been done to the package? The extent of networking? The degree of autonomy granted to sites? Can they do their own thing? Organizational relationships and the overall types of management processes. Put all of that together and you end up with a polling question. Polling question number 4. Polling question number 4 is looking at maximizing performance for a given given input as a measure of efficiency, economy, effectiveness, or all three. Maximizing performance for a given input. Another 5 seconds. Close the poll and share the results. Well, a lot of people voted for all three. It has an impact, all three, but remember what we said? If you're looking at maximizing the performance for a given input or minimizing the inputs for a desired level of performance, you're talking efficiency. Okay? You're talking utilization of resources. So how on earth are we going to do this? Where do we start? Well, what we want to do, remember, you're going to be going in and telling management, potentially, you've been doing it wrong. What you want to avoid at all costs is management turning around and saying, that's just your opinion. How long have you been the head of IS? How many years? Oh, I've never been head of IS. Well, when you've been head of IS for 15 years, the same as me, you come and tell me how to do my job. You want to avoid that. Okay. I've always had the fortunate benefit that I have been the head of IS. So I can actually answer that question. We want this to come out as an objective assessment. Okay. This is not because the auditor thinks this, or because the auditor read this in a book, or because the auditor, you gave the auditor a hard time, so now the auditor is going to give you a hard time. We want to get everyone involved, get IT involved, get management involved, get users involved in order to determine the focus areas. And there are various ways you can do that. This is a variation on a technique that was developed by a guy called Jerry Fitzgerald. Way back in the early 80s, Jerry Fitzgerald wrote a book called Designing Controls into Computerized Systems. Okay, and this was a measurement approach that he used. It was a consensus approach. In other words, you get a whole pile of different people with different backgrounds in the room at the same time, and you're trying to seek consensus on what is it we're trying to achieve here. Okay, and he recommended the use of something called the Delphi technique. Now, a Delphi technique dates back to the days of the Oracle at Delphi in ancient Greece. And the Oracle of Apollo at Delphi was all singing, all knowing. And every Greek man, sorry ladies, once again, it's a male-dominated world, or it was in those days. Every Greek man had the right once in his life to go and ask the oracle any question that he chose, and the oracle would tell the truth. Of course, you may not understand what the oracle was saying. Will I ever have a son? Well, when the moon is in the 7th house and Jupiter aligns with Mars, then peace will rule the planet and love will rule the stars. This is the dawning of the age of Aquarius. Do you understand what that means in terms of your son? So that was a real problem. So the whole concept of the Delphi technique was that you would ask one question. Each member of the group that's sitting together, give me one thing that could stop us achieving this objective. Give me one objective we're trying to achieve. Next person, give me one objective. Next person, give me one objective. And you write them down on a board. And you'll get duplications. And you'll get people saying, oh yeah, and don't forget, we've also got that one. And you'll end up with 20 or 30 things that we're trying to achieve. But then you look for common themes. Now we're doing this for effectiveness. So what is it we're trying to achieve? Okay, that. We're trying to stop outsiders getting into the computer. And we're trying to stop fraud. Okay, could we count that all as kind of access control? Yeah, okay, we can go with that. So you're trying to boil it down. Now what you end up with is 4 or 5 primary objectives. Now you've written down that primary objective, keeping the outsiders out, or maintaining access control. This group, this Delphi group, this knowledgeable group of people that we brought together, to them, maintaining access control means keeping the outsiders out, doing this, doing that, doing that, doing that. So all of the things that you accumulated, you write it down so that we don't forget any of it. So the way we do it, we're trying to identify the acknowledged processes in a specific audit unit. Now, whether that's your systems programming function, whether that's your networking function, what are the acknowledged processes? Then prioritizing those activities as they relate to unit effectiveness. Not as the auditor thinks, but as this knowledgeable group thinks. Then we want to identify the effectiveness measurement criteria which management is telling us now they rely on. Once we've got that, then we can look at those criteria and say, is that actually measuring the right thing to know whether you're achieving that objective? Whether that particular activity is actually doing the right things for unit effectiveness. Are you measuring the right things? If the answer is no, then we have a recommendation, and the recommendation is measure something different. If we say, yes, you're measuring the right things, okay, now let's go and see if you're measuring it. So now we can go and measure the effectiveness of that audit unit based upon those agreed criteria. That's what you're supposed to be achieving. That's what you're measuring to do it. Now let's go and check those measurements. Actually, you're missing the target totally. When we've come across that, then we'll make recommendations there where appropriate. We do that for effectiveness, we'll repeat it again for efficiency, and we'll repeat it again for economy. So how do we identify the process? Typically, again, we're sitting in our Delphi group. What is a process? It's a performance area within our IT function which is separately identifiable and separately quantifiable with identifiable deliverables. At the macro level, that could be project functions versus operations versus technical support versus admin, whatever it happens to be. At the micro level, we can get down a layer. We can say within our project functions, feasibility study, outline design, etc., etc. Within operations, we've got the day shift, we've got running of backups, we've got maintaining the disaster recovery plan, etc. So you can operate at the macro level or take it down to the micro level. How do we do it? As I said, we get together our brainstorming session, our Delphi group. And that's typically going to be made up of some auditors, some management, some IS users, perhaps, IT staff, definitely. And you're going to have frank discussions on that particular functional area with regard to, start it off, we're looking at, for argument's sake, effectiveness. Forget efficiency, forget economy. We're only talking about how do you know you've achieved your objectives. Once we've done that, then we can go back and say, okay, how would you know you were achieving your objectives efficiently? Then you can go back and say, now how would you know you're achieving your objectives economically? So we want a written list of the auditable areas defined by 1 or 2 sentences. And then we can rank the processes. So for each one of the 3 E's independently, you can do a comparative ranking. And there are only 3 options. A is more critical, B is more critical, or both are equally critical in this particular part of your IT function. Now, for this to work, all of your participants have to be up to date with the process involved. That's your Delphi team. And all team members get 1 vote each time. Usually when I'm doing this, I'll swing it to the left, swing it to the right, go around the group, start in the middle and go that way, start in the middle and go the other way, so that you don't end up with one person dominating the group and everyone waits to hear what he says first. And then you can do your comparative ranking. The way a comparative ranking is done is you'll take each of the processes that you've come up with for measuring effectiveness, and you'll list them down the left-hand side in the blue boxes. Then you'll repeat the same processes down the right-hand side in the blue boxes. And if we've got an A, B, C, D, E, F down there, and the same thing going across there, then I can say, okay, that A on the right-hand side versus the one below it, that B, which is more critical as a process to the achievement of the objectives of this particular part of IT? Is it A up here or B down there? If you vote for A, you vote in the right-hand triangle. If you vote for B, you vote in the left-hand triangle. Then I can go A versus C, which is more critical. A versus D, A versus E, A versus F. Once I've done all of them for A, then I can move over to B. Coming down the diagonal. B versus C, B versus D, B versus E, B versus F. And again, I'm going to put it on the right-hand side if I'm voting for the one above, and on the left-hand side if I'm voting for the one on the left. Okay, I've probably totally confused you. So this is how it works. You place all of the processes in the boxes marked in blue. Taking each pair of activity, each member of the group votes on the relative importance to this E, to effectiveness. The votes are placed on the sheet in the white, on the left if you're voting for the left-hand side, on the right if you're voting for the one on the right-hand side, which is the one above. And then you count the votes horizontally on the left, plus vertically on the right. What the hell does that mean? Well, back to my sheet. Here we had A. That was an A vote, 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 that was an A vote. That was a B vote, that was a C vote, that was a D vote, that was an E vote. Now, having said that, if I look at A, to get the total score for A, I simply add up that right-hand vote, plus that right-hand vote, plus that right-hand vote, plus that one, plus that one. All of the vertical ones under A. To find out with B, there's my B, the second one down. So I'll count the votes on the right-hand side for the B, the 4 on the right-hand side, plus there's 1 on the left-hand side, which was also a vote for B. So you count vertically on the right-hand side, plus horizontally on the left. If you're coming down to C, you've got 3 verticals for C, and you've got 2 horizontals for C. So you add them all up, and you come up with a score. And the result is a comparative ranking for all the processes. Now, this is not factual, this is not accurate, you can't do arithmetic with it. But what it's giving you is the comparative ranking in terms of criticality to effectiveness in the opinion of this expert group. They were chosen because they understood the business process. So to evaluate them for each of the 3 E's, so we do this for efficiency, for effectiveness, we do it for efficiency, we do it for economy. You place each process on the evaluation sheet, identify with the group those factors that can make or break the process, identify the measurement criteria that management is relying on, evaluate the adequacy of the indicator. If it is adequate, develop an audit program of tests to achieve an effectiveness rating, an achievement rating. Go perform the tests, report and follow up. How does it look? That's what it looks like. So based on my ranking, there's my number 1 process in this area for effectiveness. There's my success factor. That's what that process has to get right. That's how management is measuring it or should be measuring it. And we've now tested it, and this is our achievement rating. Are you actually on target or not? What is the next most critical process? What are the success factors? And we're only doing this at the moment for effectiveness. Once we've done that for effectiveness, then we can do it for efficiency. Then if it's still critical, we can do it for economy. Usually you find that effectiveness and efficiency are so messed up that it's going to take you a while to get those right before you get down to economy. So in many of the cases where I'm doing this, I stop with effectiveness and efficiency unless I'm operating in an area which is highly effective and highly efficient, and then I'll do this for economy as well. And that brings us to our next polling question. polling question number 5. And polling question number 5 is looking at identifying measurement criteria. So we're looking at identifying management criteria relied upon by management may form a part of efficiency evaluation, effectiveness evaluation, economy evaluation, or all three. Please vote now. Everyone voted. I'll close the poll and share the results. And you can see that the majority of people have gone for all three. Some have gone for A, some have gone for B, some have gone for C. Correct answer is all three. We start typically with effectiveness, because in most cases there's no point in doing it if it's not worth doing. It was Peter Drucker back in the 50s who said there is nothing as inefficient as doing efficiently that which should not be done at all. In other words, if it's a waste of time doing it, it doesn't matter how little time you waste, it's still a waste of time. So typically we start with effectiveness, but we need to do it for all three. Okay, now all we've done so far is come up with where we want to look as auditors. We've spent all of this time simply finding what it is we want to look at and what it will tell us if we find it. What it will tell us about, do we have an effective IT function or do we not? Do we have an efficient IT function or do we not? Are we getting value for money for all of this money we're spending on the IT function? This technique you can also use for any other business area, not just for IT, to look at efficiency, effectiveness, and economy in running that particular function. Interesting one to do. Try doing it on audit and see how effective you are and how efficient you are. So now we've actually got to go and do the work. Okay, how do we do the work? We go back to an information session. It could be part of our planning phase. And what we're trying to do is confirm our understanding before we start doing tests and opening our mouth and putting our foot firmly into our own mouth. Okay, so we want to then collect the evidence of the achievement of those ratings or not, an investigation of the techniques that we're going to use. We're going to analyze and we're going to evaluate. So we need to summarize the information and the evidence that we're gathering based on our tests, compare it against our audit criteria, discuss it with management, and interpret what that information is telling us regarding the achievement of those criteria for each of those processes for effectiveness, for efficiency, for economy. Based on that, you can draft your findings against each of those headings and make your recommendations for solutions. How will you know if they're achieving them? Well, it comes back to looking at what those management criteria were. Some of them we're going to be able to identify and observe simply through a walkthrough of the operations. Let me see how you do it. And how does that match against what management is telling me that they're measuring? It may be that you're going to do research to find out what other organizations are doing. You can, sometimes you can do it, sometimes you can't, but you may be able to benchmark yourself against someone. And it's not always a competitor. You want someone who's facing the same organizational problems that you are, who has got a technique for solving it. Let me give you an example. Some years ago, the London Transport Department had a problem. If you've ever been to London, you'll know that during the rush hour in the morning, about 2.5 million people hit the centre of London. They all come in the underground, the tubes, the trains, etc., into the centre of London. Not many of them drive. Most of them come in by public transport. And then you hit a dead spot from about 10 o'clock to about 4 o'clock in the afternoon. At 4 o'clock in the afternoon, the rush hour starts and 2.5 million people want to get out of London. And the transport people were saying, who do we know that has a similar problem and does it exceedingly well? And they thought, well, the Japanese railways have got the same kind of problem. America's got the same kind of problem in New York. But who do we know that actually has the same logistical problem? Never mind transport, logistical problem. Who's got to get things through a gate in a very short space of time and then get a whole pile of people out through a gate? And they thought, that's it. Disney World. And they benchmarked themselves against Disney World, because Disney World in Florida has an enormous car park. And when the gates are opening, 250,000 cars park there, and 4 people per car pile out and want to get through that gate at 8 o'clock, bang on the dot. And then they go through the park, and at the end of the day, they all leave the park about the same time. And now the kids are tired and they're fractious, and Disney's got to get all of those people back out, back in the car, back in the road, still smiling. How the hell did they do that? And that's who they benchmarked themselves against. What was Disney doing right to move high volumes of people from one transport media through a very narrow gateway and then reverse the process at the end of the day? So you may have to do research and find out who is doing the same kind of thing that your organization is having problems with. Go speak to people. You're not going to get this purely out of the machine. Study the documentation of what is supposed to be happening. Listen to rumors. Listen to the grapevine. Take it with a pinch of salt. Rumors are not necessarily true, but if it's the same consistent rumors about inefficiencies, about missing targets, listen to it and judge how much reliance you can place on it. Do statistical analysis based on whatever the measurement criteria is: performance time, downtime, error rates, rejections, hitting targets, hitting budgets. And if you're stuck, bring in a specialist. If you're operating in a technical area, particularly if you're looking at some of the auditing the effectiveness of technical services, and you don't know one end of a network from the other, bring in someone who does. It may be that you can bring in someone from another IT function. It may be you can bring in someone from IBM or whoever your supplier is to be a consultant to the audit function. It may be that you can bring in someone from your external auditors or from a firm of consultants. Reporting phase, nothing different. Exactly the same as you would normally expect. The executive summary, the introductory section, the overview, what your audit goal was, what your audit criteria was, what you were measuring against, what your findings were, the symptoms that provided you with the evidence to support your findings, and not every piece of evidence needs to go in your audit report, the cause, effect, and conclusions, your recommendation, summary, and any appendices. Nothing different because you're doing a performance audit. Your report, like any other report, has to be clear and logical. This is going to go to people who do not understand the technicalities of IT. They employ IT experts to do that for them. So your report is going to be clear, it's going to be logical, it's going to be concise. Do not give them a technical reference manual. It's got to be objective, it's got to be timely. It has to be structured, and it's got to be structured towards achieving the corporate objective. Has to be, without saying, has to be legible and error-free, professionally printed. It's got to look professional. Stick to proven facts. Focus on remedial action. People don't like to be told what's wrong. They like to be told what to do about what's wrong. It's got to meet the needs of that audit steering committee. Remember, we started off saying we will have an audit steering committee for this, and it will consist of IT and the users and management, etc. That's who you're writing this report for. And that brings us to our final polling question. Polling question number 6. Investigative techniques for performance auditing may include all except observation, compliance with laid down standards, documentation examination, or statistical analysis. Everything except. We've almost got everyone voted. Now close the poll and share the results. And we want our project functions to be measured by, project function. Our investigative techniques may include all except compliance with laid down standards. Because compliance with laid down standards is not an investigative technique. Okay. We can examine compliance with laid down standards, but compliance with it is a management function. It's not an investigative technique. Okay. I think you've had enough for one afternoon. So, any questions? Don't be shy. I'm finishing 5 minutes early tonight to make up for the minute that I was late on the previous one. Stunned silence was the loud reply. Okay, contact information. If you have any queries, if any questions occur to you after the close of this webinar, then by all means send me an email. That's my American number. You won't get me on that just now since I'm in South Africa. But you could always send me an email and I will attempt to get back to you within 24 hours. Okay. Thank you very much for coming. The last one in this session, in this series, is the Advanced IT Auditing is Managing the IT Audit Function. And that's on Tuesday, June the 2nd. And if you remember, it's half an hour earlier and it will finish half an hour earlier. Okay, thank you for coming and I hope you found it useful.